some energy. All right, before I bring up the panel, I'll just explain why I look a little harried right now. The nonprofit that I'm with, and we have some of our colleagues here today. We have Sandra and Kate from our team, my wife, Leslie. We were busy, and this is directly related to the talk, we're busy putting out our Responsible Tech Guide, which just came out like a half an hour ago, and I was running down, well, thank you, but we'll save your claps for the panelists. But I mean, sure, we can take a little energy right now. The point is, and this is what we're discussing today, is that the future of technology is intertwined with the future of democracy and the human condition. Right? The black mirror that we stare at day in and day out, and that's why we're here at A Species Between Worlds to challenge our relationship with technology. It needs to be challenged because technology is affecting us. It affects how we live, love, learn, even how we die. That's a big deal. And that's what we're trying to do with our Responsible Tech Guide, which is really tying together the people, organizations, and ideas of this nascent movement of responsible technology, which is working to diversify the tech pipeline and ensure that technology is aligned with the public interest. I'm just going to read quickly a little bit about our incredible panelists that we have today for this discussion, and then I'm going to let them briefly talk about some of the latest projects that they're up to. I just have the water because I'm running down the road, not because I'm sponsored. Although, I mean, if you want to be sponsored, it seems like a good group. The two first panelists that I'm going to introduce recently came out with a book that deeply impacted our community. And Rob, on cue, hands me this book, System Error, Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot. I should also mention that this book, System Error, is coming out now in paperback. But I had this hardcover copy for my beach read. And it was a beach read because look around, right? Technology is deeply impacting democracy at large. If you go back historically of the founding of the web, it was supposed to bring us closer together, right? When we have no boundaries, we have less differences. That's kind of our kumbaya moment when you think about something like the cyberspace manifesto of the late 90s. What struck me and struck a lot of the community with System Error is this concept. We have two of the great co-authors here today, Dr. Mehran Sahami and also Dr. Rob Reich. The idea was that you put together in a room an ethicist, a political scientist, and a technologist. That's what we need to do. This multidisciplinary, cross-sector approach to how we design and deploy our technologies to ensure that it's aligned with the public interest. Briefly, Dr. Mehran Sahami was recruited to Google in its startup days by Sergey Brin and is one of the inventors of email spam filtering technology. With a background in machine learning and artificial intelligence, he returned to Stanford as a computer science professor in 2007 and now holds the James and Eleanor Cheeseburger Professorship in Engineering. We also are going to hear from Dr. Rob Reich, a professor, additionally, at Stanford University, professor of political science, director of the Center for Ethics in Society, and also the co-director of the Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. Additionally, the associate director of the Institute for Human-Centered AI. Again, both Mehran and Rob are the co-authors of System Error, Where Big Tech Went Wrong and How We Can Reboot. One more time, we'll hold that up. Great book, highly recommend it. It was also on our Responsible Tech Summer reading list and also mentioned in our Responsible Tech Guide. Professor Emma Pierson is going to round out our panel discussion. Assistant professor at Cornell University. Emma Pierson is assistant professor of computer science at the Jacobs Technion, Cornell Institute at Cornell Tech, and a computer science field member at Cornell University. She develops data science and machine learning methods to study inequality and healthcare. You see the commonality, right? People thinking deeply about the impact of technology. Because again, the future of technology is intertwined with the future of democracy. So without further ado, I told you to save up some energy. Let's bring up on the stage, walking right behind me, Dr. Mehran Sahami, Dr. Rob Reich, Professor Emma Pierson. Let's give it up. Maybe I should have said I was sweating, not because I was running down the streets of Manhattan, but because I was nervous about the future of democracy. Rob, if we can start with you, and then again, love to hear more about your background. But one of the things that we were saying backstage that I was really struck by System Error is the scene where you get invited to only in New York, only in Silicon Valley type of party where deep thinkers, more on the tech side, maybe techno-determinist side, they were trying to decide, well, what's their utopian version of society? And to paraphrase, you're the one who has to kind of be over in the corner saying, well, would this utopian society, would it be a democracy? And that's where the record stops. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about that story.
Yeah, this is a story that was one of the motivations for me to start collaborating with people like Mehran across campus. I'm a philosopher by training, and I watched over the course of the past 10 years the humanities and social sciences drain out of undergraduate students, migrating over to the computer science department, the engineering quad. And then I got invited to this, very oddball dinner, some of the, powerful names that you would recognize in Silicon Valley, a little salon conversation where the announced topic was, what would it mean if we could find a plot of land on Earth devoted to the maximal progress of science and technology? And the host of the dinner posed the question, nice wine was being poured, and immediately a guy across the table shot his hand up in the air and said, Sergey and I have already spec'd that out. And went from there to say, you initially think it might be an island. Islands are very complicated with infrastructure, and so you have to find some other plot of land. You find some other plot of land, there's a problem that there's already people on it, so you have to figure out how to get rid of the natives. The deal is to just buy them off, and then you have a really important question. You've got a nice plot of land, you've got it emptied of people. What's the citizenship test for getting people to come devoted to the maximal progress of science and technology? We went round and round on this decision, and eventually we thought there's really nothing better than the Google hiring test. That should be the citizenship test for the place. And basically, conversation proceeded like this for another 15 or 20 minutes. I finally put my hand in the air and wanted to get into conversation. I said, can I just interrupt here to check what everyone's assumptions are about what's the governance of this place? Is this a democracy? And their immediate response was absolutely not. Democracy holds back progress, and this is a beneficent technocrat in charge of this new plot of land. And there's a chapter in the book which describes what we call the optimization mindset of the technologist, where optimization directed at certain technical problems is an extraordinarily powerful tool. When it becomes a worldview in which you expect democratic institutions to be optimizing for something, I at least think that's a massive mistake. Democracy is not a design of institutions designed for the purpose of optimizing, but for refereeing standing disagreement among citizens and forging compromises and approximate solutions to ongoing social problems. So the idea that some of our leading lights optimizing in the technical world export that idea then to everything about life, optimize your sleep, optimize your children, optimize your trash, optimize everything, and optimize democracy too. And democracy is not the governance arrangement for optimizing science. That raised a lot of alarm bells, let's say.
Well, I mean, Rob, what do you think about that, right? Because great exhibit, Species Between Worlds, again, which is kind of challenging this idea where we are between tech and humanity. And there's always a lot of speculation that our smartphones, just that hyper efficiency, is causing us to be less patient in every part. And when we think about democracy, as we well know, right, democracy is messy. To have participation, to have some level of understanding of community values, where do you see this headed? Do you see this coming back? And I'd love to, again, tie it in with your kind of call to action for system error.
Yeah, sure. Well, you're right. There's an obsession with optimization, an obsession with efficiency, and as you said, this is a collaboration between a philosopher, a social scientist, and a technologist. And my philosophical contribution to that particular point is to remind everyone around me that although you might feel like efficiency is a really good thing, it's not a first order good, it's not intrinsically valuable. For something to be done more efficiently, you have to first ask, what is the thing you're making more efficient? And if the thing you're making more efficient is something bad, making that more efficient outcome, a bad outcome, makes the world worse, not better. So efficiency can't be your first obsession. It has to be an equal concern for the goal that you're setting yourself to optimize for, to make more efficient. So all of this frequent talk about being obsessed with efficient solutions, I want to bring a more humanistic lens to the idea of, tell me how you're thinking about the problems you want to solve. I'll take for granted that you have some potentially efficient solutions, but ask some good questions. Get some good problem statements, because if you only take, the conventional example would be, you're employed by a social media company and the engineer is being told you're being evaluated on how much you can optimize click-through rates on ads. If that's the problem you're solving, is that the best use of your talent? Is that what you signed up for in terms of making the world a better place? And of course, that is the great Kool-Aid drunk by so many people in Silicon Valley, is you can have your cake and eat it too. You can make the world a better place while making a mint for your place.
Well, we saw what Silicon Valley has done with food, right? Even with Solent, even thinking about the optimization. That's it.
So the last thing I'll say, I'll open it up here too. So how many people in the room know what Soylent is? Maybe about a third or half. So Soylent is a meal replacement powder created by Silicon Valley engineers. And to my mind, remarkable statements on their website, on their rollout video when they launched. The founder is there saying, it turns out that food is an inefficient way of delivering the body's nutritional needs. You have to shop, you have to cook, you have to clean up, sometimes you have to eat with people. And wouldn't it be better we hack food in order to create a more optimal solution to the body's nutritional needs? Now, that makes sense if the only purpose of food in your mind is to serve the body's nutritional needs, but of course food has many purposes: cultural identity, pleasure of eating, sociability. And so optimizing for the nutritional needs neglects all these other values. But that's the optimizing mindset at work.
And as a fun backstory too, if you look into the name even comes from this dystopian type of movie. But Emma, I want to bring you in and then go to Mehran to really talk about this engineer mindset. That was something that also really struck me with system error. So Emma, are we in good hands? You have, a relationship with the best and the brightest, our future generation that's going to be setting the tone for how we develop and deploy technology, specifically in areas that there's concern with, whether it be problems of social media, especially around kind of governance, around speech issues, and now with everybody now having the buzzword of talking about the metaverse. So I'd love to hear about your own kind of relationship and then the relationship with the students and where you think we're currently at right now in 2022.
Yeah, I think that's a great question. So I'll say first, I definitely relate to Rob's complaint about sort of the overprevalence of the optimization mindset. I mean, I think I've fallen victim to that myself. I am an engineer by training. And it is addictive, to have a gigantic computer and terabytes of data and see your algorithm, running at the speed of a thunderbolt. It gives you superpowers, and it is very easy to just be like, oh my gosh, this is so fast. And you're like, optimizing train schedules for some dystopian regime or whatever, right? It's very easy to, sorry, I've never done that, to be clear. But I do think, against that, I'm recruiting students now. I've just started my PhD lab at Cornell Tech, and I see a lot of hunger, you know, in PhD students to try and work on problems that matter and that make the world a bigger place. I mean, a better place. I mean, I would be curious on your guys' perspective because you have a longer view on this than I do, but I do know, you know, when we were with the students we were trying to recruit, we're overspilling my New York apartment, which is maybe a sign I need a bigger apartment, but like, is also, I think, an optimistic sign for the future that like, you know, there's certainly a hunger. Maybe often that gets subverted into, well, really the way to make the world a better place is to optimize ads for Facebook, and here's, you know, a $300,000 salary to convince you of that. But I certainly think there's desire in the students I see. Yeah.
Mehran, there's a kind of a Yiddish phrase that was popularized a few years ago by Malcolm Gladwell, right? That says, to an earthworm in horseradish, the world is horseradish, right? So I'd be very curious from your stand, because you're deeply involved, right? Your early history at Google, which has been massively influential on our relationship with technology, and it's also been obviously wildly successful. Love to hear about your own perception, experiences, and then also I'd love to hear a little bit of the backstory of how you came together with Rob and your colleague Jeremy. To write System Error, and what was kind of that motivation for you, right? Because there's easier ways than schlepping across the country and speaking about this call to action. You could be pitching a new startup and making a lot of money, right? So you seem to be intentionally choosing a path that's not necessarily for riches, but for the good of democracy. I'd be curious of what your motivation is behind that.
Well, it's a good question. I think part of that notion of becoming trapped by the context you're in is an easy one to think about. Part of the notion of boiling the frog, in the sense that sometimes what we do is we get ourselves into a particular situation where we have good intentions, we believe the people around us have good intentions, and there's organizational goals we're trying to achieve. And over time, things change little by little. And at some point, we always have to remind ourselves, why did I sign up for this? What am I doing? How does it contribute to the ideals I had when I originally got here? There's this quote by Adlai Stevens that I really like that is, you know, he's talking actually at a college graduation when he says, when you leave, remember why you came. And so I always kind of think of that in mind, is when I'm at a place, why did I come here? And so in the early days of Google, it was an exciting place precisely because what we were trying to do was make information available to people. And some of the things that were powerful in those early days were very visceral. So, you know, one of the early conversations actually with Sergey Brin that convinced me to go there was he was talking about Google saving someone's life. And I was like, it's a search engine. How does it save someone's life? And he says, like, here's this email from a woman whose father was essentially having a heart attack. And so she went and looked up on Google his symptoms. It let her know that her father was having a heart attack, and here's the steps to take when someone's having a heart attack. And by the time the paramedics came, they told her, had she not done those things, her father would have almost certainly died. And so it shows you the amount of power that having the right information at the right time actually has. And so that was a very compelling value proposition. And so when I was there, the slogan, don't be evil, which you might remember from the early days of Google, we really felt that. We believed that. There was a group of people we worked with that we all believed that. And there's a bunch of things we saw in the company where we thought we can make more money doing that, we can make more money doing that, we can make more money doing that. We're not going to do any of those things because we feel they're evil. And what happens over time is an organization grows and you get more and more perspectives, you get people who are building careers, you get these metrics that are put in place of the things that people want to optimize. Company goes public, there are expectations from the market to be able to generate more revenue. And so what you get is this greater and greater push toward optimizing metrics of the company that have a greater and greater divergence from what your original values were when you went there. And so that notion of, well, we can do this other thing, we can track this additional piece of information, we can generate more revenue because that's the metric we're trying to optimize, grows over time. And so at some point, that's when you have to reflect on yourself and say, is this what I signed up for? And at some point you say no, and that's when you have to make a value judgment and you change your career, your perspective, whatever the case may be.
Yeah. I should also mention that I want everybody to start thinking of some questions. We do have a good amount of time saved, in about a half an hour for some kind of questions to go back and forth. But Mehran, since you were mentioning don't be evil also brings to mind the earlier, since also shifted motto for Facebook of move fast, break things, right? So don't be evil and move fast, break things are two ones that have been kind of seared into our imagination as, wow, time has really made us reflect a little differently on those statements. So I'd love to go around just the panel and hear from everybody. It seems very easy to shoot problems, right? There's a lot of problems right now, especially in an area like social media. It seems almost like shooting fish in a barrel, so to speak, of saying, well, wait a minute, why are they this powerful or making these decisions? But I'd love to really dip into the harder dilemma, which again struck me with your book, System Error, around saying, we already know there's a problem, but what does a collective solution look like? And how that ties in with a motto, and then Emma, we can start with you, is, and if you need more time to think about it, we can kind of call you later. But if you had to come up with a motto that you think a company like Google or now Meta should have, or that you would just like for the tech industry at large, we're talking about digital technologies, what would it be, right? Because we can make fun of move fast, break things and say, well, look, they broke a lot of toys, right? Should it be, move slow and fix problems, right? Yeah, a lot of people have really created a lot of fun puns on that. So Emma, from your work with Cornell and Cornell Tech, what do you think? How would you want to convey this message to your young and nimble, malleable, potentially, minds that seem to be at this precipice of directing us towards our better angels? Or are we going off a cliff here? I mean, I got to say, I don't want to be worried, but, authoritarianism has been on the rise, right, the last 10 years. There are a lot of bad signs in terms of the healthiness or the lack thereof of our discourse, especially between political parties or stagnation within the United States political process. So what would you say, Emma, for like a phrase that really comes to mind for you?
Yeah, I don't pretend this is catchy, and I don't think it'll be a solution to all the problems you just enumerated.
We have an entire audience here at a very creative event, A Species Between Worlds,
right, exactly.
that can help us, and then we'll make our millions. We'll just remember to trademark it later today so it doesn't get squatted.
I'm not going to tell you my idea till I know if I get the profit.
Well, backstage, you made me sign the NDA, so I did have that. You being a technologist, you sent me over the DocuSign, so I do have that clear.
That's true. I guess I have
Yes.
to. I will tell you what I.
substantial problems with that.
Yeah, I'm going to give you the standard issue philosophical response to that, which is the question's badly posed. It's both. It's not an or.
I figured you might say that.
We need both the engineer to assume a set of responsibilities, that it could include questions like, should I build this thing? But to my mind, I don't disagree with that, but I'm familiar in a room full of technologists that the typical stereotype a technologist has, maybe most people have for that matter, about what happens when the philosopher shows up in some discussion. It's like the ethical police have arrived, you should slow down, you should really be deliberate, do you really need to do that? Consider right and wrong. And I'm cast as an Eeyore in every conversation. That's not merely a drag interpersonally, but I think it also is a just massive mistake about what the contribution of philosophy is. So in addition to thinking about should we build something, and the answer sometimes being no, the much more important thing in my view, in the philosopher's one contribution in this respect, is to say, any human life, personally, professionally, politically, is a confrontation with moral complexity, ambiguity, and trade-offs among important values. And the idea of you getting the correct answer to every moral question built into a technology is a simple mistake about how to think about values. There might be better and worse answers. In fact, I think there are. So it's not as if you just consult your gut and go with that. But you have to become comfortable with thinking, what are the most important values at stake in this thing we're building? How am I deciding how to weight those values? And what predictions do I make about what this will mean in the broader social, political, economic landscape if this product gets to scale? So let me just give you a concrete example of this. This is something we talk about in this class we teach, something we talk about in the book, something that you'll all be familiar with. On your phone right now, you almost certainly have an end-to-end encrypted messaging app, whether it's Signal or iMessage or WhatsApp. That technical accomplishment of end-to-end encryption is a way of trying to put a thumb on the scale of one particular value, privacy, so that you can have fully private communications neither the government nor a company nor anyone else can intercept and see. Now, anyone who thinks about this also knows that there are other values at stake, personal safety, national security, so that if messages on a phone are meant to coordinate a crime or to upload child pornography, do we really want to say that there's only one value that matters, and it's privacy in all possible circumstances? It's, to my mind, the technologist has a responsibility to approach an answer to that question and offer a justification for the set of choices they make in building a product. And, of course, there should be countervailing pressures that come from outside. So you don't put all of the burden on the technologist or the engineer or the company. We also say that other organizations can try to have regulations and guardrails and various policies that constrain the choices and, in the language of an economist, contain the traditional negative externalities of big companies once they become entrenched. At scale, we shouldn't expect things to work optimally in all circumstances. We know from history that almost never happens. And sometimes it's the responsibility of technologists, sometimes the responsibility of government, civil society actors. Basically, we all have responsibilities. I mean, the final thought about this is, it would be, in my mind, a disaster if tech companies hired chief ethics officers, where you outsource to a single person as if it were legal compliance. There's a hard question about values. Let's bring in the chief ethics officer to tell us the best answer. No, we need everyone in the entire product stack, as well as beyond the company, to feel some responsibility for putting in the foreground the set of values that are at stake, and then arguing about that, where there won't be a singularly correct answer. There'll be better and worse answers, which you have some responsibility to strive for the better.
Well, that's what I'd be curious about, because do you think, Rob, that there's a need to kind of change the overall media narrative? And I'll give you a concrete example. It seems like every day there's another story about how can we fix social media? How can we fix Meta or Twitter or TikTok? Whereas right now, major cities across the country and globe, right, are struggling with crime. But nobody says, how can we fix crime in New York? We say, how can we reduce it? And we naturally are kind of multidisciplinary and thinking about it in terms of layers and complexity and this holistic approach of saying, well, it deals a little bit with mental health, and it deals a little bit with the economy, and it deals a little bit with the weather, and it deals with jobs. and it deals with law enforcement. We don't see it as, what does this one side do? We see it more like a Rubik's Cube where there's an interconnected part. So if you were, and I know you have the ear, right, to media, all three of you do. What would you say, and I'll ask this to everybody, and then we'll get back to the motto question too. How would you like to change that overall media narrative? At least in my opinion, it seems a little too pat right now, where it's, well, wait a minute, we have a problem. What can this one person do? If only our senators weren't so old and out of date, they don't even know what TikTok is, right? Yeah. We tend to frame it as if we're looking for this silver bullet, because you know what's not sexy? The truth. And the truth is, this is hard work, and there's trade-offs, and there's massive disagreement. One of the examples you kind of alluded to happened last year, right, with Apple trying to go after CSAM, which is child sexual abuse material. You would think, who in the world would support this? Nobody supports it, but it deals with values, because as soon as that tool came out, you had privacy advocates who really created a backlash, and then Google had to instantaneously, say, wait, we have a PR disaster, and then backtrack on it. Right. It wasn't because they're pro CSAM, it's because these are complex issues with different understandings and values behind them. So how would you change that media narrative?
I'll say one thing here that I'm going to prompt Mehran to tell a story that, or give an analogy that he's often used that I think speaks directly to this, which is, I think one of the really problematic frames that we have, as you said, is looking to fix a problem as if there's a silver bullet solution. And of course, the people that we expect to fix the problem are the engineers, for the most part, of the companies. There's an apology tour, they say they'll work harder on it, and the solution will come out and it'll be better. And that kind of frame offers up to us ordinary people as citizens or users basically a binary choice. You can use the product as designed solely by the people who offer it to you on the terms that they have chosen for you. Or if you don't like the product, then the answer is just delete it from your phone. You can either use it in its intended set of conditions or delete it entirely. And that's another false binary in terms of thinking about technology. And I'm going to shepherd it off to you for your wonderful metaphor.
Well, I think one of the things to really drive Rob's point home is if you were to delete Facebook from your phone or Meta or whatever you want to call it now, does that make you immune to the effects that it has on our democracy? And if it doesn't, then you understand exactly what the problem is with just saying the choice has to be yours to use the app or not use the app. You are not inoculated against the societal effects of that technology by your personal decision. Your personal decision on a browser to set your security settings or to take cookies or not, every time you come to a website, you can thank the European Union actually for that, which actually has some goodness in it. Again, does not inoculate you from all these effects. And so what we need is a systematic approach to a systematic problem. And the analogy we use is thinking about the roadway system. So if you think around the turn of the century when cars started being the turn of the last century, when cars were being mass produced, right, we didn't have much regulation around cars. The idea is you get a car, you're just kind of driving along. And there were horrific accidents where a bunch of people died. So what did we do? We said we need lanes. We need to have people driving on a particular side of the road. We're going to have speed bumps around schools. We're going to put in stop signs, traffic lights, a whole bunch of guardrails on the system. Now, at the end of the day, we never told anyone you can't drive. We said the choice is still yours if you want to buy a car and drive or not. So you still have that liberty to make a choice. But if you make a choice, you now make it in a system that has guardrails for everyone, so everyone is safer. That's the same kind of thing we need for technology, is systematic solutions that say we're going to apply guardrails through a deliberative process like our democracy to understand how we make the system safer for everyone, and then within that you still have a choice if you want to participate or not.
If we want to dig beneath the surface on that, when we think about American history and car safety, another concept that comes to mind, especially for the tech conversation, is Ralph Nader and unsafe at any speed, right? Because I think it's interesting to kind of point out that when Ralph Nader, right, was originally kind of arguing for seatbelts, right? Watch It's a Wonderful Life. George Bailey is not wearing a seatbelt, and he's drunk driving. There's a lot of issues, right? Even though it's a great movie. So So when Ralph Nader was saying, hey, we need to have seatbelts in cars, well, the car industry was against that. They were saying, well, this would be too expensive. And think about the choice, right? It's kind of like the helmet debate. Well, who is this helping, right? And that's why you have states like New Hampshire that are still against it. But where would you say, because you also talked about kind of the European Union, and Europe has been a lot more proactive on a lot of these issues around GDPR, and earlier the right to be forgotten, and especially right now around social media. So where would you say we're going in the United States with this? Are we reaching this kind of guardrail moment where you think there's going to be more of a proactive approach in kind of the U.S. Policy front, or do you think we're still at such a stagnant moment, right? Because one of the most prominent laws that tends to be mentioned in this space with social media is Section 230, coming from the Communications Decency Act of 1996. I always mention that date in there because social media didn't exist in 1996. That's before Facebook, before MySpace, and hey, it's even before Friendster, and maybe even before 6degrees.com, right? So it's really quite an ancient time period when we think of how do we react to this. So where do you say we're going if you had to look ahead the next couple of years? Make me an optimist. I'm feeling kind of pessimistic today.
I think there are things to be optimistic about. They're just not as sexy as some of the debates that you see, coming in front of Congress now, right? No one's putting a 15-week ban on using Facebook. And so there's other things that are capturing a lot of our mindset. But there are things that are actually making progress. So for example, California passed something called the California Consumer Privacy Act that has many of the same safeguards as the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation in California. And now there is actually national legislation kind of working its way through the system. And there's actually reasons to believe that some of the big tech companies actually would rather have that national legislation than 50 patchwork legislations in all the states. So they will still lobby to try to get the language that they want in it, but there's reasons to believe that that will go through. There has been a lot of local efforts to think around algorithmic transparency and accountability, something that Emma knows a ton about, so I'll throw it over to her in just a second. And the thing that's important here is, like all of us talking, one of the themes in this whole discussion is the importance of having multiple stakeholders at the table. You don't want just regulators and lawmakers making those laws without input from technologists, without input from ethicists. And what we're actually seeing, the thing that worries me a little bit, is the language in some of that early legislation from a technological standpoint just doesn't make sense. One of the things actually that's been proposed is a modification for a Communications Decency Act, CDA 230. I'm not a lawyer, I don't have legal training, but as a citizen, I read over that and I could identify the one line where I say, everyone's gonna argue over these two words. Because no one knows what those two words mean. I, as a technologist, don't know what they mean. I don't think any lawmaker actually knows what they mean, and everything hinges on the carve-out on those two words. So what we really need are more people involved to say, these aren't two words here. We need to have a much richer conversation around what happens there. And I think Emma probably has a lot more to say there as well.
Yeah, Emma.
I can say some things I hope will happen. I don't know if I can
Go
say
for
they
it,
will
yes.
happen for sure.
And we'll revisit this. This is being recorded, so we can revisit
But
it
it's
and
not
see.
a prediction. It's like a wish.
Okay.
You guys,
Well, we'll take wishes too.
Yeah, wishes are good. One thing I hope will happen is sort of more stringent protections on the to Mehran's point, the data that you can collect on people, even data that people don't appreciate the power of it. An example of this is like the location data collected by your cell phone, right? Like your weather app may be tracking you as you go around the city. Hopefully everyone in the audience knows this. That data is, the companies claim it's anonymous because, it's not linked to your name or whatever, but there is no such thing as anonymous location data, right? Because if I know where you go all the time, I can figure out where you live because I can geolocate where you are at night. That means I can link to your address, and then I can track you as you go to gay bars or psychiatric clinics or cancer clinics. And this is not a hypothetical issue. And so I think there needs to be sort of more stringent regulation of the types of data that companies are allowed to collect, and we can't simply rely on consumers to be like, oh, I opt in, it's fine, you can, I think governments need to step in there, and they need to do so in conjunction with technologists because, your typical congressperson is not going to know how to infer someone's home location from a geolocation trace, but that is something that certainly can be done, and it's not particularly hard to do. I think another thing that would be great is, we need sort of regulation on algorithms to first ensure that they actually perform as they're advertised. So like before you roll out your healthcare algorithm to predict life-threatening algorithms or life-threatening outcomes on millions of people, like sepsis, there needs to be like someone from the FDA looking in on it to make sure that it actually performs as advertised, for example. And I think a third thing that would be great is like, we need regulation to ensure that algorithms perform equitably, with the knowledge that equitably is very hard to define, but like across subpopulations, right? So if you have a facial recognition algorithm that performs less well on people with dark skin, and then that's being used in policing contexts, like that's a big problem. If your speech recognition algorithm is failing to transcribe accurately for people who speak African American vernacular English, like that's going to be a big problem. And these are not, again, hypothetical examples. These are real things. And so I think those are all things I'd like to see.
I was watching, recently finished, highly recommend it. It's called The Dropout on Hulu, with a famous Stanford dropout, Elizabeth Holmes. And what really struck me about that show, based on true story, unfortunately, is the fact that bureaucracy, as unsexy as it is what brought down Theranos. It wasn't super well-established, highly intelligent, well-credentialed individuals on the board. Didn't happen initially through a lot of the other employees, but it was just the bureaucracy. So you mentioned kind of the FDA, and then go with what Mehran was saying. It really kind of brings to mind this idea that maybe the conversation seems to be changing from this personal kind of responsibility, right? Because when I sit down for dinner after today's panel, I trust that my lettuce that's on my plate is safe to eat. Nobody said, well, David, if you don't like the lettuce, if you don't trust the lettuce, then hashtag delete your lettuce, right? Nobody says that, and it kind of reminds me of how a few years ago people would say, well, if you don't like it, you should read the terms of service. That's a well-worn idea, right? Read the terms of service. And I said, well, that sounds good until I think about it and say, you want a 13-year-old to read a legal document that says that that legal document can change at any moment. So, Mehran, I'd be curious, do you see this changing to more of a collective action? And I think this really ties in with system error and what really I left inspired by. And that's, again, why I read it on the beach. I was looking at waves and thinking, this is what we need. We need to shift from the problem stage to a solution stage. But I think we're struggling with this change of narrative. We're looking for this one person to come in, right? We want Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson to come in and say, I'm going to solve this problem. Here's what Meta should do. So I'd be curious, where do you see this going? Do you think there's going to be additional kind of agencies cropping up? But that comes with its own issues. We saw what happened with the disinformation kind of panel that I think it was the Department of Homeland Security created that quickly kind of flamed out because of its political kind of issues. I'd be curious, where do you see this kind of headed over the next couple of years?
So that's exactly the kind of question we bring up with our students is what are the different roles? And I think the roles happen at multiple levels. So there are some things you can do as an individual. They are limited, but there are things you can do as an individual. And it's what role you have as an individual. So there's probably a lot of engineers in this room. And one of the things that's interesting is when students first come into our class, they see a bunch of these issues and they think, I'm powerless to do anything. We say, you are actually one of the most powerful people on the planet with respect to these issues because you're going to be going to these companies and you're going to be making a bunch of these decisions. So don't think you are powerless. Now, in addition to the fact that some people, might be in the tech sector, some people are not, we're all citizens of the place we live. We have an obligation to get involved, to understand what the issues are, to actually make our voice known. Voting is sort of the simplest common denominator, but there's a bunch of ways to be able to get involved, to bring out that kind of collective action, to bring out awareness of what the issues are, and actually get people to understand that these things actually matter. And it's only in the last, 5, 10 years or so that some people have really been willing to stand up. The Theranos example you bring up is because there were a couple whistleblowers in the company who are willing to stand up, and we're seeing that now happening with technology companies in different forms as well. But it shows the power of people who have more power than they think they otherwise do to be able to affect that narrative. At the end of the day, I think that's where we need to get to. Our democracy, which as Rob described is slow and deliberative rather than being optimizing, has to be able to discuss these issues and achieve a consensus if we believe we should use our democracy, which we absolutely should. Right? We shouldn't just give up and say, well, Orrin Hatch at the hearings doesn't know what he's talking about. Part of the reason why we have some of the problems we do is we've made decisions. I'm going to channel Jeremy now, who's our third author, to let us get to this place. We used to have an office called the Office of Technology Assessment back in the 90s. There was a nonpartisan office whose job was to assess technology and make policy recommendations to the Congress. What happened to OTA? It got disbanded in the contract with America, if you remember that. There's no reason why we can't bring it back. But what it requires is a will, and what that will comes from is citizens being willing to demand it and say, we need this is important to us, bring it back, and it will help us make better progress in that collective decision-making that actually leads to the outcomes we'd like to see.
I love that. Yeah, and it seems to be, at least in my perspective, a little bit more of a sea change going on, whereas in previous years, I remember doing a talk one time talking about the right to be forgotten, and it blew parents, and it blew them away. They're thinking, well, how could this even be possible? He said, well, just because it hasn't happened doesn't mean it can't happen. And to your point, it seems to be about the political will and the demands. So, Mehran, I want to get your motto, and the same with Rob, and then we're going to hand it over to some kind of audience questions for 20 or so minutes. So, in your capacity, and then together, right, at Stanford University, and that's a key university to mention, as long with Cornell Tech, but Stanford in particular is the most well-known university in terms of its tie-in as a pipeline to Silicon Valley, right? So if you think about it, I don't know where that would be on the analogy if maybe Stanford is kind of the blood that's rushing into the heart of the tech industry. So Mehran, 1,500 students a year, right, go through one of your courses. So you're molding, in a large extent, the future of people who are the creators. What would you want them to take away for your motto? This doesn't have to fit on a bumper sticker, but just something. When we kind of queued up earlier, right, as you mentioned, don't be evil, and I had mentioned move fast, break things. So what's the one sentence you'd want people to know?
I mean, certainly something I'd want the students to know, but I think I'd want everyone in this room to know is you have more power than you think. It's just a matter of whether you choose to use it. Mm-hmm. And it's finding the ways that you can actually use the power that you have to affect the change. Sometimes we think like this is all just a wave, it's washing over us, we're helpless to do anything, we're counting on someone in Congress to do the right thing and solve the problem for us, or Dwayne Johnson to come in and, with 600 pages of legislation and slam it down on Schumer's desk and be like, here's the answer, gotta go solve my next problem. That is not gonna happen unless people in this room and people around the country say that's what we want to happen. So it's on us to make it happen. Yeah. And we all have more power than we think. We just got to get out there and do it.
Well, I will say that's actually why my organization, why I named it All Tech is Human, to reassert that human agency, to kind of go against this idea that technology is falling down from the heavens and singularity is near and there's nothing we can do, as if we're not the ones who create, to your point, the guardrails. So Rob, take us home before we go over to audience commentary and questions.
I'll give it a try at least. So I want to offer up a candidate for a...
Oh, we are going to vote on who has the best motto at the end. No, that's not true. But
here's a candidate for the worst motto possible. In addition to the move fast and break things, I once visited a tech company where the big poster on the wall said, act, comma, don't think. All right, so if I had to replace something, so we've talked a lot about the actual optimism that in the book and in the class we have with respect to a policy window opening for democratic institutions to rise to the challenge and to do historically what they really have done quite frequently, which is allow innovation privately stimulated in the marketplace, which consolidates over time into a small number of companies, which is where we are right now with big tech and the sort of monopolistic presence of the big tech companies. And then government slowly rises out of its slumbers to try to contain some of the worst problems. And I think we're in the opening moments of a window where the next 10 years, 15 years in the United States at least will be marked by those challenges. Doesn't happen overnight. All right, but I want to strike a note for a motto that looks not to democracy, but to the professional norms that technologists seem to have so few of. Now, you mentioned Elizabeth Holmes and the Hulu film.
Yes.
One of the other things, I mean, like, I find Elizabeth Holmes' story cinematically interesting, narratively compelling, but morally boring. There is no moral argument on behalf of doing what Elizabeth Holmes did. So there's no moral complexity involved in that case. If getting to a better outcome in the world were simply a matter of everyone getting an ethics class in their university and a moral compass installed in their brains which would guide their actions forevermore, we would just expect everyone to be angels and everything would be fine. But of course, that's not the world we live in. Everyone having personal responsibilities, telling Elizabeth Holmes, don't lie, cheat, deceive, steal, whatever the case is no solution to a problem. It's systematic, and so we can go to democracy and democratic institutions, or we can go to professional norms that extend beyond the personal moral compass of any individual. And those, of course, exist within the medical profession. They exist within the legal profession. Things that fall short of the law but go above anyone's private or personal moral compass. And the Hippocratic Oath, of course, is one very good example of that. And you know, the provocative way I'll put this is that computer science is a relatively young field. The discipline only came into existence in the 1950s. The people who got training as computer scientists really only got power in the world as people creating companies in the early 2000s. And unlike the law, unlike medicine, which has many more decades and other forms of scandals, of really horrible outcomes that then arose, gave rise to a set of professional norms, my view is that, you know, AI researchers these days are like 19-year-old teenagers. They are newly aware of their great power in the world, but their frontal cortex is massively undeveloped and they're socially irresponsible. And so we need to accelerate the development of a set of professional norms for technologists so that they don't move fast and break things. They think, what binds us together as a set of professionals? And if I may, I'll just end with another example. The other, in my view, biggest technological innovation or scientific discovery of this century is CRISPR, the ability to engineer the human genome or genes in general. And the co-discoverer of CRISPR is a biochemical scientist out in the Bay Area named Jennifer Doudna. And if you've read the Walter Isaacson biography or if you heard her speak, you know the following story, that a few months after this great discovery where she recognized the extraordinary power and what was likely to happen after learning how to edit the genome, she had a nightmare. The nightmare was Hitler appeared to her in her dream and said basically, Professor Doudna, I'm very interested in your technology. And the next day, she organized her fellow leading high-status medical researchers and tried to put in place, and did put in place, a voluntary ban, a moratorium on using CRISPR on humans. And when one researcher did do that a few years later, he was immediately excommunicated from the responsible practice of science, disinvited from all professional conferences, and no journal would publish his articles. Those are not legal policy changes, those are professional norms. Can you think of any AI researcher who has done something that violated a professional norm and they suffered a reputational cost for it? Not really. Not yet. So my motto, if I had one, would be accelerate the development of professional norms, which is not going to be the product of any one person coming up with a checklist, a little, to-do framework for you, but an activity of the field in general. And that's part of the project that we're engaged in.
Yeah. And from the snaps that I heard, I think we're going to have some incredible questions. So I do appreciate all of the conversation so far. So Josh, Do you know, I think we'll actually, right, we'll take up some questions, but I think Josh there, or Sandra, there's a microphone that I believe we have for questions. So if we can just hear from a few individuals, and then just flag down the, if you look back here, there should be a microphone going around if you want to ask a question. And then when you come up and ask a question, just kind of briefly state your name, and if you want your affiliation, just so we know where you're coming from.
Hi, my name is Arash. My affiliation is I'm Canadian. So good luck with all of that. No, I had a question. So one of the themes that I'm sort of hearing is that there needs to be greater oversight and maybe regulation of the activities of these companies and so on. So how do you accomplish that when the people that are in a position to do that are bought and paid for by these same organizations?
All right.
It's another familiar historical pattern that consolidated market power gets translated into political influence. So the phenomenon you describe is not just something that began with technology companies. Of course, I'll tell you, I'm sure all of us will have our various criticisms of Citizens United or campaign finance laws or various other forms of political influence through money, and those would be the root causes of the problem. But even there, that's not a kind of insuperable barrier to change. And what I point to in the US context is that Lina Khan is now the head of the FTC, and she's going to be able to try to, at a minimum, saber rattle about antitrust action that has already arrested the attention of companies and is, in certain respects, increased their own lobbying efforts. But these are the ways that government traditionally can and does act. And in my own estimation, as I said before, we're in the beginning stages of it. So would I like to fix the forms of political influence that seem inappropriate, unjust in democratic society? Yes, but that's not a complete obstacle to change.
All right, looks like we have a few more questions. If you just find the microphone, and then they'll come to you.
Yo.
Hello.
Oh, thank you. Phil from Canada. Rob, Mehran. Yeah. Okay. So I will hold it. But so a few days ago, Meta disbanded their social impact, not the responsible innovation team. And so I guess just digging a little bit deeper to Rob, what you're saying is like, what do you think is the kind of roles or skill set that in the next decade is less vulnerable to market corrections and priorities of big techs? Thank you.
Ron or Emma? I would just briefly say that that's actually directly what we approach in our Responsible Tech Guide that I mentioned came out today. You can freely download that at responsible-tech-guide.com, and we are very familiar with a lot of the individuals who are on the Responsible Innovation team at Meta that recently got disbanded. But on the flip side, we released 100 companies that recently started responsible innovation teams. You have a lot of activity and growth kind of in that space in areas like tech and democracy, tackling misinformation, hate speech, disinformation, trust and safety, new institutes popping up like the Trust and Safety Professional Association, Integrity Institute, TS Collective. So there's a lot of activity in that space that might be something a little bit more specific to Meta with their branding shift, and Sheryl Sandberg recently leaving, and a shift to really heavily promote the, wait for it, metaverse, right, where that is going. So Emma, do you have any kind of thoughts on that around the skill set? Here you are at Cornell Tech, dealing with so many students that are going into this field, and just to kind of cue that up a little bit, one of the frustrations that we find at All Tech is Human with students, we have our University Ambassadors program in about 90 universities across the globe right now, and one of the issues that students always mention is they get a little upset, to be honest, at the university, because they say, well, wait a minute, I'm being told that the future is multidisciplinary, and we need an ethicist and a political scientist and a technologist. And how do I have that interdisciplinary approach when, university structure tends to be very discipline-centric. I mean, you do have like Mozilla CS Challenge, and you have a lot of activity in that space around, Rob, to your earlier point of kind of making an engineer changing the mindset a little bit and taking kind of ethics course. And you're heavily involved in that space, teaching some of the courses. But I'd be very curious of where do you see that going to this question around skill sets, right? Do you see a lot of kind of hope or activity or any kind of thoughts in that area?
Yeah, so I guess the question is, how do you sort of create people with both sort of the technical excellence and the
Yeah.
multidisciplinary
The
skill
fuzzy
sets?
and the techie, if
The
you will,
fuzzy
based on
and the
another
techie.
Stanford term in the book of that name as well.
Yeah, I mean, I was a Stanford undergrad, and I don't know. I mean, I mostly like the education I got, which actually started not with you, with you. No, seriously. I mean, Stanford has like a great books program where you spend the first year sort of reading the classics and arguing about whether Socrates was right, et cetera. And I think that was enormously valuable. And then there was sort of another 3 years of mostly technical education for me. But I definitely think the combination of those has been very useful, and that theme has continued, to present day. I mean, in lab meeting today, we had a presentation from a new PhD student, and he wanted to talk about what he called the algorithmic panopticon, and he quoted Foucault, and I was like, all right, this is the new breed of technologists these days, I guess, good fun times. So.
What do you think, and then Mehran, I'll ask you this question, do you think we need to almost change that term? Because with all tech is human, we get bombarded with these kind of newer terms. Like I know at Microsoft, right, they have a whole kind of commitment around responsible AI, responsible innovation, and democracy, and you meet a lot of people who are creating these newer titles around kind of this, social technical or social technologist, right, creating this kind of merge, or what I like to say, it's like if you have the fuzzy and the techie, right, if you have this peanut butter and jelly, how do we create a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, right? If, at least in my opinion, the future should be interdisciplinary. We're dealing with complex issues that really kind of merge so many schools of thought. So where do you see that headed in your own kind of relationship with not only students, but students that are deeply impacting the course of human history? I know that sounds large, but that is actually kind of true.
Well, I think maybe to try to reduce it to the practicalities of what does this actually turn into in a tech company is I think it's instructive to actually look a little bit at the history of the software development process. I mean, with the Facebook point, I'll just go out and say, I think it's a mistake, full stop. And there's been lots of companies in the past that have made big mistakes like that and then realized, AT&T disbanded their machine learning team 20 years ago. Asinine. They had probably the best team in the world doing that, like better than any university. They didn't think it was worthwhile, right? And so there are big companies who make bad decisions, and in retrospect, I think it will be very clear that that was a bad decision. But I think what that means in terms of bringing these mindsets together in terms of how we make a change is if you look at the history of software development, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, people were just like hacking code. And at some point, people realized, what, we need to do a lot of testing before we actually put this out. So they created whole organizations around quality assurance, which at large companies have thousands of people in them whose job is just to test the quality or try to break the software. And then probably about 30 years ago, people realized human factors, how people actually interact with the software is huge. And so we got a bunch of user experience, user interface people who are embedded in the product development cycle. Probably what we saw in the last 20 years or so, especially as more software went online, was computer security. And so no large software house that is respectable does not have a serious security function in the delivery of software. And I think where we need to get to in the evolution of that process, we need the notion of societal assurance. We need to have people who are embedded in the software engineering process and every large software house who understand coming in that we need to ask these questions about who's impacted, how they're impacted, what these impacts actually mean beyond just the bottom line of the company, and that has to be part of the development process.
Well said. And looking at time, I think we have time for another 1 or 2 questions, but I will also say we're going to be here until 8, and if our panel would be so kind, come up to them specifically for questions that you have. I think the microphone's going around if you want to raise your hand, and then, go ahead.
Hi, Patty Maas, MIT Media Lab. I've been at the Media Lab for over 30 years. We were very involved, as much as Cornell and Stanford, in developing a lot of these technologies that now rule our lives, recommendation systems, personalized newspapers, all of the above. And it wasn't necessarily that we were so naive and weren't thinking about the consequences or the ethical issues and so on. I think these types of systems we're building are just extremely complex. They're complex systems, and we are putting them out into the world for like billions of people to use. So they also have an enormous impact because of the scale. So I'm wondering what the panelists would say are some other solutions that we can adopt, because I would argue that just making sure that every engineer also has solid ethics training and thinking, and that we slow down development is not enough, actually. And personally, I think doing living experiments in smaller communities where we introduce some of these new technologies is another interesting methodology for understanding better what some of these complex systems may lead to.
For anybody who did improv, this might be a yes and, right? We can have that and something additionally. So Emma, have you go with that. So what would you say to that about the kind of limitations around how we curb some of these larger kind of issues?
Yeah, no, I think it's, I mean, I do think it's a really tough question. Actually, I want to add even an additional problem, if it's okay, rather than posing a solution, which I realize was not what you wanted me to do. But I think also there's the problem that, like, even when we do recognize we should slow down, it's like almost impossible to stop all the different AI actors, AI being my field, so that's sort of what I look at. And a recent example of this is sort of the deployment of like models, which basically if you give it a language prompt, it can give you a picture back, right? So first one company is like, no, we'll put this out, but only behind guardrails. But then someone else was like, no, you can just download our model off the internet. And then a third person's like, we'll make it really, really easy for you to use. And I am quite flummoxed by like, how do you slow down progress in a world where like there is enormous incentive to keep pushing, and like even if 98% of actors are well-intentioned and sort of cautious, like even if 98% of engineers have good ethics training, you need like just one engineer to be like, whoop.
And it's also a global issue, right? Because it seems like it's a very geopolitical issue. I mean, even when Zuckerberg has been, in front of company going to do? So, Rob, any other thoughts with that?
Inhabit the predictable philosophical role here. I mean, like what Emma was just describing, for anybody following the latest in tech news on Twitter or elsewhere, about these large language models, foundation models, GPT-3, DALL-E 2, this new stable diffusion, exactly the trajectory that Emma just described. Starts off in some gated way with some limits on release to everybody, and now is basically open for anybody to use, download, or even run it on your computer. And to my mind, the utterly galling thing about this, because I don't want to be the philosopher who shows up and says, slow down. It's, again, always the role of the ethicist to say, why don't you think a little bit more? I want also to say that what this represents is a profound misunderstanding of something that technologists frequently throw around in this space, which is open source orientations count as democratizing AI. And when you reduce the idea of democratizing a technology to the idea that anyone can use it, you forget entirely that democracy is a system of governance. It's not something that means simply, let's let everyone touch it and play with it and see what happens. It would have been horrible if we had democratized access to nuclear fusion. It was a really good thing that uranium and plutonium was limited and couldn't be widely distributed. And if AI tools these days are something akin to even a fraction of the power of nuclear fusion, the idea that we're democratizing it and making it available for anyone is a nightmare, not a dream.
Rob, I think that is a great, powerful thought to kind of wrap up the conversation. Even though I saw a lot of hands and a lot of questions, we could continue this conversation for umpteen hours. So I will say, as we start closing, stick around for the next half an hour, talk to one another, ask your questions to the incredible panelists. And I'll also say that I know a lot of you who are here today, and there's a ridiculous amount of talented people across civil society, government, industry, academia. So turn to your left, turn to your right, and start having those conversations. So I want to thank Emma, Rob, and Mehran to really challenge us for how we can kind of co-create this tech future that's aligned with our interests and the good of democracy and the human condition. So let's give it up a round of applause for our incredible panel. So thank you all.